And welcome back to another edition of the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine. We're here talking politics in the Finger Lakes. Jackie, it's been a month since we've been here, but a lot has been going on.
Yeah, I think usually things slow down in the summertime because like state legislature's on break and stuff, but there is a lot to talk about. It's been pretty active.
When we were kind of brainstorming the different things that we were going to talk about, like every time we do the show, it seems like we get our list, we get things set up, and we're really confident, and then something crazy happens that just kind of tips one or two or three or all of those topics on their head. But we have perhaps one of the more personal things that I'm always so torn when I see things like this. It's like when an elected official or someone gets a DWI, or if they seek treatment or help or something like that when they're battling something like addiction, it's Go ahead and take the lead on this one, and then we'll continue this.
You know, he announced after the legislative session was over, Majority Leader Flanagan, that he was going to check himself into rehab for alcohol. And, I mean, you know, everybody was praising, good for him, admitting what's going on, getting help for it. And I don't take issue with that. I think, great, yes, we need to be open about these things and supportive of people when they get help. But I don't understand, like you were saying, this is nothing new, right? Elected officials struggling with various issues. What I don't understand is...
people in general.
In the news, right? I mean, what I don't understand is the unwillingness for anyone to ever take a time out from their seat, right? So he didn't give up the leadership position. He didn't say, given all the things going on and the toll that this is taking on my family, I ought not to be the leader. I mean, let alone talking about resigning the seat. But I don't understand that, because I feel like if you're an elected official, you're making an implicit statement by being there that you are a well-qualified, competent person to hold that seat, and that really there isn't anybody else who could do it any better, right? Mm-hmm. Or you've put yourself out there as the person who has the most to offer. Mm-hmm. But if something like this is going on, and you're distracted, you're having issues that in non-elected officials' lives would be incredibly disruptive, would cause people maybe to take a leave of absence from their job or lose their job. The idea that elected officials get to hang in there because there's no vehicle for removing them, right? But I just wonder if this isn't indicative of our larger problems, which is that people feel entitled, once elected, to conduct themselves however, and there's no real accountability till the term is up. And I don't know, I just found it disappointing. I think I would have been rushing to praise somebody who said, I've got an issue that clearly interferes with my ability to do the job and might call into question my judgment and my ability to represent people, so I'm going to step aside and let somebody else in, because I don't know. I
think I was watching Capitol Tonight when this story first broke, and they had said that he attributed his problem to the actual responsibilities of the speakership.
Yes.
You know, I think there needs to be some sort of line drawn between, you know, what you're dealing with in your personal life, whatever those matters may be, and how it impacts your professional stand, like where you stand in your job and things like that. Right. Granted, I completely understand where the frustration comes from, because, you know, you can say that if you're admitting that you have this problem, has it affected your judgment? If you're admitting you have a problem, you're kind of admitting that it has, or that it's at least on your mind when you're thinking about your job and you're thinking about, like, the things that, you know, the various responsibilities you have. That said, you know, would I necessarily want to see he or anyone else under those circumstances just be sort of tossed or asked to, step back or step down, if this is where I think it kind of becomes, if this were to become a trend where 6 months from now he is once again having to go back into a form of treatment. And I think that the circumstances and the how and the what kind of treatment you get is totally personal. I think that is an individual decision to be made. No one else should be interfering with that. That said, if needing treatment becomes a trend, then you are getting into a place where I think there's a little more credibility to what you're saying in terms of you need to step back. You have to step back.
Yeah, and I'm not even saying that, people should try to remove him, because ultimately, that's the job of voters if they're dissatisfied. But I guess what I'm saying is it's discouraging to me to feel like this is yet another instance where our expectations of elected officials are so low that we would say, you know what, there probably isn't anybody who could do a better job than a guy who's currently on a leave of absence because he's in alcohol treatment, which he says is a result of the stress of the job. Mm-hmm. And I think in our personal lives, people don't necessarily make those same choices. So I don't know. I just feel like when you become an elected official, you do have like an elevated responsibility to do the job in a clear-headed way. And whether it's an addiction, whether it's a conflict of interest issue, which I think we'll get into in a second, I think there comes a point where there's like a lack of self-reflection when it comes to elected officials. No one ever wants to say, maybe I'm not the best person for this anymore.
Right.
Because I think there's too much ego. But at some point, you've got to be willing to say, my time here was well spent, and now it's time to do something else.
Well, and that's the other thing, too. I feel like for ego combined with I've climbed this mountain,
right,
and here I am.
No one's getting me down from this.
Yeah, it almost, I would assume that there has to be some sort of survival instinct that goes into how those types of situations are handled. That said, so one of the big things, and this is kind of connected and not quite, it's not a straight line, but I'm going to relate this to the common folk, the average everyday people who heard that story or saw that story. They probably didn't care. Because one of the big things, and this is from the news guy's perspective, mm-hmm, when someone gets a DWI or someone gets a DUI and the story gets pushed out onto the various social platforms that exist, the number one comment we see is readers saying, who cares? Why are you smearing this guy's name for something that now you can have the right and wrong debate about it, and that's fine. But I think as far as how people feel about it when they encounter it, I don't feel like they have as much of an issue with it. And also, I think there is the sort of like the PR side of it where you didn't hear about this until he was checking himself into a facility or seeking treatment or doing, it wasn't like you heard about this being a problem. It was him saying, I have a problem. Right. And I think from the PR standpoint, that was probably well planned. It was probably executed that way intentionally.
Yeah.
And, people will receive that a lot better than taking it the way it actually should be taken, because it is an issue. It is like, it did obviously have an impact on his job. It was caused by his job. But he now, in a way, comes out of this looking like the bigger person, looking like the one who,
I
took
think
care of
it. He really would have if he had said, and because I was, unable to deal with these issues, I'm going to step aside for a little while and then hopefully resume when I'm able. Mm-hmm. I feel like the assertion in keeping the leadership position is basically saying none of my colleagues could do a better job than I can from rehab. And that just strikes me as like a strange position to take.
And that was the other thing too. I had heard the story. I saw some reporting on it when it first happened, but I wasn't really able to get a clear answer in terms of like what kind of treatment he was receiving. Right. So was it just like a quick outpatient kind of thing, or was it like, was he staying someplace permanently? Those are the kinds of things that go into whether he could continue doing his job effectively. And, maybe just because it was the middle of summer and it wasn't in the middle of session, that's why there wasn't a step down or a back off.
Oh, I'm sure that he has a lot of reasons. I guess I'm just saying, if we don't talk enough about addiction. I mean, people do, right? They say, well, we have a heroin crisis. We have lots of addiction issues. But I don't think the news covers it enough in detail because maybe, like you say, maybe people just aren't interested. But I think if people who deal with addiction treatment know it's not like a one and done. Like, sure, he can check himself in, but recovery will be an ongoing thing. And if he's already said that the pressure of the job was a trigger, to say that he will continue to put himself in that situation and that we should all just feel confident it won't happen again, I just feel like that's what everybody says when they're having trouble. Well, don't worry, that's not going to happen again. But I think, history shows it's not that easy. It's not that easy. And maybe people, deserve a different leader for a while.
Yes. So
it's not going to happen, but
it
just
it is
me,
it is interesting that you actually mentioned the coverage of any type of substance abuse issues, because that is the trend, at least from my perspective, that there is a faltering, a lack of coverage of, you see the police reports of, X number of people arrested for selling heroin or crack or whatever it may be. But at the same time, you don't necessarily see the story being told about the people who are going through and winning the battle. And you also don't hear the story as much about the people and the facilities who are trying to make a difference on that front.
Yep.
And it does kind of create this. There may be a level of people just don't really want to hear about the really, really depressing stuff. And that's kind of where people,
Yeah, I think this is another area where the community could use a lot more open truth-telling. No one's perfect. So I think talking about these issues, helps people understand them. But
so, speaking of truth-telling and all those things, this was probably one of the more puzzling. This was strange to me. So you had the Marsh Creek, I believe it was at Marsh Creek. The discharge of estimated 5,000 gallons of untreated sewage at a creek that empties into the Seneca Lake resulted in park officials shutting down the beach 2 days later.
Right.
So your angle on this, I feel like, is taking Geneva to task. Meanwhile, I think I'm going to take the DEC to task, so you go first.
Okay. I was just really stunned to read the city's response because, first of all, it was disappointing because it appears as though they didn't learn anything from the Foundry situation, right? So it's like you've had all this community dialogue about how people just want to know what's going on. And especially when it comes to things that might involve neighborhood public health. And instead, there was this just really blasé, like, oh yeah, that happened, we were required to report it kind of attitude. And then the follow-up, which I have to say, was incredibly disappointing. And I have tried to champion Matt Horn as city manager as, a really invested, community-oriented guy. I've got to say, in the past couple months, between the foundry and now with this issue, I'm really stunned by the lack of empathy and concern about the people of Geneva. Like, I'm not saying that, he's not doing a good job in terms of downtown development and spearheading those projects. Mm-hmm. But a city manager cannot be tone deaf about people's basic interests. And that is what bothered me. And I don't mean to actually even put too much solely on him. I understand he's trying to fill a vacuum of leadership, right? It shouldn't fall on him to make a public statement anyway. This is the kind of thing your council, your mayor, the elected officials would take accountability for. But absent that, because council always seems to be absent, Matt's statement was kind of a nothing to worry about, nothing to see. And he's got to understand that against the backdrop of the foundry issues and all the stuff that's coming to light now, especially his response to the DEC statement where he tried to tell us it didn't say what it really said, which that puzzled me. He's got to actually show some concern instead of just saying, well, the solution to pollution is dilution, which was his, don't worry, it's a deep lake comment. People don't want to hear that. Nobody's fooled by that. So I was disappointed and stunned because he's a smart guy and I felt like he would have known better.
So I guess I'm kind of confused. I'm confused to the side that, so the beach closure was announced via Facebook in a very short little blurb. The Finger Lakes Times, who I pulled that reporting from before, that little blurb that I read, they reached out to the DEC. DEC had no comment. Mm-hmm. So the DEC, I got the email and text message because I've signed up for DEC alerts, and I would actually suggest anybody who gives even the slightest margin of care about any environmental, their local environment, do that. It's easy.
We should post how to do that because I haven't done that. I would love to do that.
It's right off the DEC's website. Right. Super easy to do, and we will link to it beneath the video window. That said, when one state agency says there has been a leak or a failure of some kind, and then another state agency, another state-run thing takes 2 days to respond, when in theory they're working from the same pool of information. Right. That just makes it defies logic.
Yeah.
And then to not come out with a full statement and just, quickly brush over it, mm-hmm. you leave a lot of uncertainty. And I can only imagine, now you criticized the officials in Geneva, I can only imagine that the communication between the DEC, Geneva, State Park was terrible. I would just assume. I would assume, because otherwise it probably would have been handled a little more efficiently. Beach would have been closed on Friday. The the failure happened, I believe, around 6:30 in the morning. That was when it was reported. That's the kind of thing that it's like, okay, what has to happen?
Well, that is the question, right? What would be the situation that would rise to the occasion where the city said, we need to tell the residents, and the state said, we need to tell the other state agencies that might be impacted, and everybody says, yes, we ought to let people know? Because right now, there's a lot of shrug your shoulders, it's not that big of a deal. And the problem is, objectively speaking, it may not have been a big deal. Mm-hmm. But the lack of information and the lack of alert is a big deal, because it sends the message that either this is too complicated and we're not going to bother talking to you about it because you won't understand it, which is insulting, or we know better than you do about what's serious or not, and on the scale of 1 to 10, this is low, so we'll just wait till there's actually something we want to tell you about, which seems sketchy. So just avoid all of that and be open. I think that's been overwhelming message to Geneva. Just open up the lines of communication. And here was a really easy way to show that they'd heard the message, and it was another miss.
Now, one of the things that I had noticed, it seemed to, well, obviously, something like this comes out of nowhere for elected officials, for city officials. This is not something they're expecting to be dealing with. Obviously, I'm not quite as critical of the city of Geneva for not getting the message out as quickly, because I'm going to assume that their priority was actually fixing the problem.
Agreed.
And right, like everyone can agree with that.
Right.
But I think that the issue here is, and it's a theme that we've talked about over and over and over again, is messaging is important. Mm-hmm. And by and large, messaging is either absent or terrible in most municipalities. Now, I will say, personally, as a non-resident of Geneva, I do not live in Geneva, but I feel that Geneva does a much better job of it than other communities in the area.
I would agree with you.
That said, I think every time now it's a matter of, as you're pointing out, this is not the first recent incident, and you start to get into an area where it starts to pile up, and you keep eroding the confidence that people have. Right. And that's the really troubling thing, because it's really, really, really hard to gain that back as it goes away.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's the double-edged sword, right? If your community is doing a good job of communicating on most stuff, as I think Geneva is, right?
Yeah.
You want to know when the farmers market's open, you want to know what's going on at the library, you can find out. City's doing an excellent job communicating. But if so then when something like this happens, where, if an alert's going to go out to council, we've had this break, it could very easily go out, we've had this break, check back here for updates.
Right.
There is communication going on, and in this day and age, it's not difficult to push that out. Mm-mm. So the question then is, well, why not? Why not include that information? And it just... Yeah, it does feel like a disconnect. You got to know your people. You got to know your community, and this community wants to know.
Let me say this: I think from watching some of the smaller communities that really, really struggle with it, I think they haven't quite realized how easy it is to actually convey a message. I mean, it literally is as easy as posting a message to your Facebook page or whatever the case may be. Those are the means that people use to find out what's going on. Right. And I think I hate to say it, elected officials who are majority older, skewing in that, say, 50 to 60 to 70-year-old range, you get into territory where they aren't comfortable with the new methods. Right. And it's a matter of they either aren't willing to take the calculated risk that they see with using it, or they just don't understand it. Yeah. And that's where I kind of feel like you need employees who are willing to and understand what's going on with it, so that they can actually, convey that message quickly. Yeah, and maybe the logical next step with that problem is creating a functional system, a laid out plan. Okay, if as a municipality, say you're Geneva, Seneca Falls, Penn Yan, whatever you are, you have this problem. Step one, you send out your emails to all of your employees or do whatever you have to do. Then you create a message with your attorneys and whoever else you have to. You share that to all of your social people, and then you continue on and you send it to newspapers, organizations, things like that. Right. And it's got to be a matter of just executing at that point. Yes. But creating the plan, that way there isn't that intimidation factor associated with it. Because that is something that even as a digital news organization, that's something we see there. Our older audience, if they aren't really in tune with technology and really already connected to us, it's really hard to sort of bring those dedicated newspaper folks into the fold.
Yeah.
Because it's a new, tricky thing.
I agree. I think those are all incredibly valid points, and that is, I think the city of Geneva deserves a ton of credit for having an excellent staff and having a really great communication strategy. So, and that's why I'm always saying, Matt's a great city manager, and part of that assessment is because he's built such a solid team.
Yeah.
The problem is when something like this happens, then you say, well, wait a second. You've got the people. You've got the strategy. You're making these intelligent decisions in all other realms. Why this? Why was this missed? Mm-hmm. And that's what creates the distrust, right? Because you can't just say, well, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the staff, they don't know how to do this, they don't do it well in other cases either. In this, it does feel like an outlier, and then you have to ask, well, why? Why was this in particular missed? And that's what's been unsettling, I guess.
It is kind of, I think maybe this also, you say the distrust snowballs, but at the same time,
right,
all the things that they're dealing with are also snowballing. So I kind of wonder at what point is the team that's dealing with all of this stressed and, really barely struggling to stay afloat.
Yeah. I guess if you're working, though, against a backdrop of having messed up, right? Like, so if you find, we've really broken trust in the following way, it is your job to be extra vigilant, to say, that's not going to happen again, and we will demonstrate over time on the smallest issues a commitment to getting it right, because that's the only way you rebuild trust.
Right.
If you miss something big and then you continue to miss the little things or be sketchy on the little stuff, all it does is say, you know what, this is actually maybe just part of their way of doing business, and that then people start to check out and you lose people, and that's sad.
So, speaking of distrust, the fundraising has begun. And this is not just, we have titled this a Governor Cuomo issue.
Yeah.
But this is not exclusive to Governor Cuomo. Fundraising season for those who are running next year is well underway. It kind of never stops, and I think personally that's where I come down on it being a big issue. Just keeps going. Like, you're always just accumulating and it doesn't really seem like there should be a season for it.
Right.
There should be a deadline for it so that you don't have people playing with unreasonable amounts of money, and the money isn't driving the politics, and the money isn't driving the results. Because if you have a war chest to spend and you're an up-and-comer who doesn't have a war chest to spend, we know who's going to win that. We've seen this sort of play out over and over again.
Yeah, that's why we should have campaign finance reform that allows people access to untainted money.
Wait a second. Let's not get carried away. But
that would be too sensible.
Happen. Yeah, and that probably couldn't be achieved given our current state political climate.
Yep.
So I guess what made you raise your eyebrows about the fundraising efforts you've seen across the state thus far this summer?
Yeah, I guess the articles that made me concerned were the reporting about Governor Cuomo bringing his head of economic development, the State Economic Development Corporation, to paid fundraising activities, which were also either hosted by or generating contributions from contractors who might have in the future or currently contracts through these economic development awards and projects. Mm-hmm. And again, that's just another situation where why do that? Why raise the specter of pay-to-play politics by crossing those boundaries? Bring your economic development director to unpaid speaking engagements in the region, right? Let them meet with community leaders and meet with private industry if they'd like in a public forum, not a closed-door session, to talk about things that are going on. But when it's at a dinner, when it's at an afternoon, get together at Skaneateles Lake, it just, again, I think it just feels like people who care about good government, we're constantly getting like beaten over the head with disappointment, right? People who could have done better and instead are sloppy or sketchy about stuff. And that was disappointing to me, because I think Governor Cuomo's done a lot of good stuff. I have a list of criticisms as well. Mm-hmm. But this just seemed like unnecessarily muddying the water around these economic development awards, the DRIs, the Buffalo Billion. Like, why make it look like something that I'm sure it's not? But who knows? Because now it's tainted the water. No pun intended, back to our previous topic, but it all does kind of go together.
I feel like my issue with the whole fundraising via paid dinner or whatever the case may be is that it does definitely foster this idea that politicians and elected officials are disconnected from the common folk. When you see the prices on the dinners, when you see all of that information kind of come out in the stories that follow these events, that's where you start to you're showing this person who makes minimum wage, or this person who is eventually going to vote for you, that you're taking money from people who are paying $2,000 to just show up at a dinner, which in theory, what good do they actually do?
Right.
It's a network. Is it a networking event for these elected officials to talk to these influential, powerful people within the community?
Definitely.
Or is it kind of just a smokescreen to make people think that they're networking, when really it's just a formal, it's a formal thank you for padding the banks? It's a really challenging to me. Nobody wants to see that gap between taxpayers and elected officials grow any more than it already has.
Right.
So, if I were talking to someone who were running for office, I would almost say, figure out another way to do it.
Yep.
Don't have the dinner. Don't have the really pricey dinner that's going to make headlines, 3 weeks from now.
Yeah.
And at least make it look like you're actually interested in what the people all the way down the line care about, and not just what, these people who can throw thousands of dollars at your campaign think.
I mean, I've been on both sides of this issue, right? Because it's not free to run for any elected office. Mm-hmm. There's always some expense. Granted, the more kind of scrappy you can be, the less you will spend. So, like, for my mayoral race, like, I didn't cross whatever that threshold was for fundraising, because it was low budget, right? It was right. Like, you get your message out on social media. That kind of stuff doesn't cost anything. Mm-hmm. But there is still a need. I mean, locally, people buy signs. Some people take ads out in the newspaper. Those kind of donations, when you're kind of crowdsourcing a campaign and everybody's giving you $10 or $20, seems like a grassroots effort. But like you said, when there's an exclusive dinner and somebody's paying $3,000 for their ticket, I don't know. Maybe to them that feels like $10. I mean, maybe those are just the kind of people that it's just an order of magnitude higher. But I'm led to believe that if someone's paying that much money for a dinner, they're not going to be satisfied with just shaking someone's hand and saying, we've met. That there is going to be some assumption, once that person's elected, that it's like, hey, remember I was at that dinner, I gave you $3,000, can we talk about this issue that's important to me? And that is I don't think I'm making that up. Like, I think that is what happens.
Isn't that the definition of networking?
I don't think that's networking.
You're talking to people who can eventually have an impact. I'm talking on a very basic sense. I'm not talking about the sleazy background stuff, but literally, like, this is, and if I'm not contesting anything of what you're saying, I'm just literally saying, I think that's the purpose of them, and it's masked as networking. And really what you're talking about in politics, if you're networking that way, you're really just laying the groundwork for exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, it's paid access. I mean, that's, if you want to network, then, like I said, come do a public discussion and then maybe or charge your campaign donors, to pay for a seat, a nice plush front row seat when you're giving this talk that's open to everybody. Yep. There's a way of allowing people to contribute to your campaign and get closer to you. But when it happens in a private situation, a private setting, and I'm usually an optimist. On this particular issue, I feel quite cynical that it's not going to change. But you can see what it does, even locally, right? I mean, if you have a business or a person with a particular interest who gives a disproportionate amount of money to a local candidate, it's reflected in what that local candidate does once they take the seat. Right. And it shouldn't be that way.
So, very good segue right there. An issue where people have been discussing that very matter.
I'm waiting to see what's next.
We are jumping right into the,
yes.
of course, the public hearing where
segue.
Seneca Falls residents have said that money is impacting the way elected officials are making decisions. Mm-hmm. That's been the narrative for months. So the decision is now in the hands of DEC officials who will decide whether an extension will be granted to a required state permit for Seneca Meadows. It's funny. I talked to people on both sides, and both felt that the turnout validated their cause.
Interesting.
And I feel like that's typical because people hear what they want to hear. They don't necessarily hear everything, and that's totally fine. The reporter, our reporter who was there, said that the turnout was more against than for. Of course, subjective. Everyone is going to have their own view, their own thought process. And if you're talking, I know a lot of people have also been getting into everyone who was against it kept saying the same things over and over again. And sure, if you want to, bunch people up like that and say that, because 10 people said the same thing or roughly the same thing, that's really like one person speaking, that's fine. But I've also heard that about the other side. Yeah. I've heard that a lot of people who have business with the landfill were speaking, and people who in the community in some way, shape, or form benefit from Seneca Meadows were there. Okay, we get all of that. And in a lot of ways, I feel like this is where we've been for the last year and a half. Mm-hmm. Nothing has changed. We're still here. The landfill's still here. A lot of folks are still really riled up about it and want to see it shut down. They have a lot of great arguments. The other side has good arguments too. But we're in a holding pattern. And until the DEC makes a decision, we're going to stay in that holding pattern. And my fear is that after the DEC makes a decision, we will remain in this holding pattern because I feel like the resistance to it isn't going to go away. And I'm curious to see how that actually impacts the way Seneca Falls, Seneca County, the way the Finger Lakes is able to do business or execute their jobs moving forward. I still don't think that there's going to be a mass exodus of residents in Seneca Falls or Seneca County because of the landfill continuing to operate or, ceasing to operate. I guess my curiosity, as someone who spoke at the hearing, what was your take? How do you feel about it now? How do you feel the event went?
Well, I thought the hearing was well run. It was convened by an administrative law judge from the DEC. So there were good parameters about speaking. There was a stenographer to make a transcription of everybody's comments. I thought everybody was respectful. Everyone on both sides was able to be heard. As far as that goes, the hearing, I think, went very well. There were other members from the DEC that were there. I saw them taking notes. I saw them listening intently when people were speaking. So I think that was all done very well. When I spoke, I actually have the same concern you have, which is that regardless of whether they get the permit or not, the renewal or not, the things that are being discussed aren't going to change. Yep. And the DEC, in my opinion, actually has the ability to intervene in a way that they seem not to have been interested in at the time. So the way it was explained at the hearing, and this was very educational for me to hear how this goes. So when people call in their complaints, Seneca Meadows is required to investigate the complaint and issue a report. If the report finds that there was an odor, then that report gets filed with the DEC. If there's found that there was no odor, then it's not that call, it's as if it never happened. Mm-hmm. Now, to me, and this is what I said during my comments, that seems like a miss. Right. Because first of all, you're asking the agency against which you're filing a complaint to do its own investigation. That seems abnormal. That's not how people would handle their lives. If you invited a contractor over to work on your deck and you felt they'd not done it correctly, you wouldn't ask them to come over and re-inspect it. And then if they say it's really okay, you would get a second opinion. You'd ask someone impartial, the building code guy, and you'd say, is this actually done correctly or not? We can objectively determine that. So that seems odd that they do their own investigation. It also seems odd that the complaints themselves are only taken up the chain of command when they're found to be justified, because it seems like the DEC has a policy interest in knowing what the rate of phone call complaints actually is in real time. Right. Then it was also brought up that in Albany County, the DEC and the city of Albany, or the Albany County, have implemented an air quality monitoring system as it relates to some diesel traffic near residential buildings. So I had suggested that the DEC, as a condition of permit renewal, assuming they allow the permit, should require an actual objective monitoring system with data that can be accessed by the public at any time. So it wouldn't be something that Seneca Meadows would pay for, wouldn't be something that only they would have access to. It would be a public monitoring system. That would generate objective data. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that I said was that I did feel like the DEC was giving disparate and favorable treatment to air pollution as opposed to other forms of pollution. So, for example, the Marsh Creek issue in Geneva, if this were a wastewater treatment plant, if this were an oil storage facility, if this were another tire recycling facility like they're adding to the permit, they would actually have like a schedule of what needs to be reported, and here are the consequences for certain types of offenses. Right. There isn't that same kind of oversight in regard to the landfill. So my ultimate thing was, I don't think you should renew the permit, because clearly they're so far out of compliance, you wouldn't do business again with someone who had a repeated track record of not being able to take care of their business originally. Right. But if they are inclined to renew the permit, they have to actually protect the environment in an objective way. So, I don't know. Again, I remain optimistic that something will change. Either they will get serious about their role in environmental protection and pull in the reins on the landfill, or they will, at the minimum, start generating objective data that the public can access that will tell us whether they need more oversight going down the road.
Right.
Those are the only changes I can anticipate happening, because you're not going to, if things continue the way they're going, you're at an impasse. Mm-hmm. That's, the gap between people who work at the landfill or benefit from the landfill and people who are negatively impacted by the landfill is as big as the landfill itself. Like, it is an insurmountable area. So, yeah, I don't know.
So, we're to the point in the show now where we're going to jump to hits and misses. But one of the topics that I wanted to, that is a miss for me, is something that I think you're going to have some input on. The threats made to elected officials in Seneca Falls, and also the threat that was simultaneously, allegedly, made toward one landfill employee. So a gentleman, a Seneca Falls resident, John Gary, was charged with making a terroristic threat a felony after an incident that happened in June. And as I understand it, and this has not been confirmed by the Seneca Falls Police Department, it was a phone call with a DEC official where some form of threat was made to about Supervisor Greg Lazaro and another an employee of Seneca Meadows. That said, this, and the reason why I feel this is a miss, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this, is because this really puts Seneca Falls in a bad place. A really, really, really bad place. Whether he did it or not, whether he's found innocent or guilty, it doesn't matter, because the harm has already been done. Because there is now going to be a ton of people on one side of this issue who say, see, this is what those people are like. Right. And we don't need more of that. We need lots less of that. That's really what Seneca Falls has become about now, is this us versus them. Right. It's the anti-landfill against the pro-landfill, or whatever you want to call it. We don't need more of that. We need less of that. And this really just kind of, and it also, I feel like, sets maybe a dangerous precedent. And I'd seen this, a couple people were talking about this on social media after the initial reporting of the arrest, that this kind of sets a bad precedent, because it's going to make people talk less, not more. Yeah. Because if you're worried about if you don't trust the other side, and you have to at some point have a conversation with the other side to come to some sort of middle ground, this situation is not going to make more conversation happen. Right. This is going to make less conversation happen. I think this is another example of dividing the community even more, and that's why it's my miss. But I also wanted to get your opinion on just what you thought of that. And as a former elected official, I mean, there are always going to be some people who are angry with you. Right. That's kind of a given. But how do you feel as you see other elected officials have to deal with, and even just employees of companies have to deal with this extra burden now?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, I don't know enough about the details, mm-hmm. but from what you're describing, I mean, it's never okay to say stuff like that. I also, have had things like that said about me in a more bold way, kind of to my face, and have actually had stuff happen. I've had broken windows. Mm-hmm. I've had a brick through the window. I've had my car windows hit with golf clubs, always over taxes, always over pilot agreements, and which interestingly, I opposed, but the people who could benefit from them feel strongly about it. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't do anything except further polarize the situation. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's wrong to say stuff like that.
Right.
I don't know enough to talk about whether or not like those charges are appropriate or anything. But
well, and that's it. Let me be perfectly clear here. The police report was pretty vague in terms of outlining there were no specifics. There was no clarification on who was involved or anything like that. We've just been slowly working through the process of talking to the elected officials, town board members, that kind of thing. And we're slowly getting, you're getting little tidbits.
Right.
But this afternoon at 2:30 in Seneca Falls Town Court, there's going to be a felony hearing for Mr. Gary, who will, I'm assuming at that point, the details of how this all came to be will become more clear.
Right.
But yeah, my concern actually, because Mr. Gary, along with many, many, many other elected officials, or non-elected officials, residents in Seneca Falls, feel very passionately about this issue. And if you're only going by tone and not what is actually said, there have been multiple incidents in the last year and a half where at either a town board meeting or a community forum or something like that, where the tone, where it feels like you're on top of this bubble that's about to burst.
Right.
And things could get really ugly really quickly. That's just kind of been the nature of the beast for the last year and a half in Seneca Falls. That said, the concern is all about this is dividing the community even more.
Right.
It's awful.
Well, yeah, I mean, when things are tense like that, what you need is leadership. You need people who say what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, and who respect reasonable dialogue and don't allow nonsense.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that might bring me to my miss.
So I'll quickly hit my hit, which is Watkins Glen.
Oh.
Getting the $10 million for the DRI.
Yeah.
Great for them. Great. Really, probably one of the most underrated gems in New York State, as far as like places that aren't underrated, get plenty of exposure, but at the same time, it isn't necessarily like a Geneva or something like that where you have a lot of fanfare and things like that. Once a year for the race in Watkins Glen, of course, but the state park and everything else, the southern end of Seneca Lake, a lot of great things happening there. And this also, I feel like, kind of opens the door for other, I'll say, smaller communities who might have thought maybe the DRI was out of reach or unreasonable. Mm-hmm. I mean, Watkins Glen is not a thriving metropolis.
Right.
Very busy, bustling little community. But it's nice to see the state saying, this is good. What you guys are doing is good. This plan is good. So kudos to them. Hope they make the most of it, and I hope they are able to, spend that money the right way. What about you?
My miss, I guess going kind of dovetails with yours. I was listening to another podcast yesterday, Evan Dawson's Connections, and Representative Reed was on it, Tom Reed, and when asked about the violence in Charlottesville, instead of making any kind of affirmative statement that would show leadership, that would show what's acceptable and what's not, that would help to make clear where we stand as Americans, instead used his time on air to criticize the governor of Virginia for what he said was critiquing the state police. And I went back and read the governor of Virginia's statement. I don't see any critique of the state police. And I was just appalled that Reed would use this issue, this opportunity to make a statement, to turn it into something political and misrepresent what somebody else said, someone who I think actually dealt with the issue very well. I think there's bipartisan agreement that the governor of Virginia's statement was the right statement at the right time. So that was my miss. It overshadowed all my other misses that I was going to point to. My hit, I guess my hit would actually be prior to what we just talked about. When I went to this DEC forum, the feeling that I got that everybody listened to everyone, and that the points that people were making about their personal experience of their peaceful and quiet enjoyment of their house being disturbed by the landfill was actually being heard and taken seriously, not just by the DEC, but by the residents or business people that might have been there to support the landfill, who still were able to come up and say, you know what, I like the landfill as a business, but I don't want to discount my neighbor's experience.
Right.
And I felt like that was actually an example of a good conversation about a really pressing issue. But I understand that's just one snippet of what the larger conversation has been.
Right. And I believe the deadline hasn't passed for written testimony for those who want to submit. I believe the 18th is the deadline.
The 18th,
I believe
yes.
So those who want to share their opinions still can.
Yep.
But that's going to do it for us this time. We'll be back in a couple weeks, most likely, getting closer to fall, which means we're going to be talking more about elections, campaigns, that kind of thing. A lot of topics that were very near to what I wanted to get included in today's show were things that I know we're going to have to talk about at the end of this month and next month.
We always have topics.
So that's going to do it for this week's pod. Remember, hit that subscribe button if you're checking us out on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and give us a follow on Twitter. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Debrief Podcast.